It is Sunday, September the 8th, 2019. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, Phrenological Frenzy, the virtues of not getting your head checked. Yes, we're going to dive deep into the world of phrenology, which lasted hundreds of years. It was not a flash in the pan movement, as you might have suspected. We'll get to all that, its characters and implications, and a bit more. But of course, before I get to all that, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant and have become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to each and every one of my patrons. I really appreciate your support, without which I could not do the work that I do. Sorry, this episode took a little longer than I really wanted it to. There is no set release date or episode schedule of any kind for the Distant Peasant Podcast. I'm never absolutely committed to getting something out every week, but I do try. Usually I average more like 9 days, but this one's more like 14, so I appreciate your patience. If you're one of the few people out there who've been just hankering for some Distant Peasant podcasts, that I'm sure you exist. Alright, on with the show. So in H.P. Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth, that's the only piece of fiction published while he was alive, 1936. The narrator/main character travels to an isolated and depressed old New England fishing town. Now, over the course of the story, the narrator becomes aware of a secret cult dedicated to the worship of an ancient race of creatures known as the Deep Ones, and that nearly every inhabitant of the town is descended in part from these creatures. Through childhood and their early years, they look very much human, but after reaching adulthood, they begin to slowly transform into Deep Ones themselves, and end up leaving the surface world to dwell in the darkness of the sea, prey monstrously at evil ocean-bottom temples. All horrifying stuff, but the greatest terror is saved for the end, in which the narrator discovers that he too is descended from the people of Innsmouth. He has ever stranger and more alien dreams, notices that he is beginning to resemble the abyssal creatures that he dreams of, both in his mind and now in his waking life. The narrator is a prisoner of his biology, which will remember his genetic destiny even as he actively fights that recollection. His only real choice is whether to embrace his horrible and monstrous existence as an immortal but forever alien creature, or embrace the horrible uncertainty of death. That story ends with the narrator's choice to embrace his fate, but the idea that ultimately we are all prisoners of our biology and genetics is a horror as old as heritage itself. Shoddy scientific racism was all the rage when H.P. Lovecraft was writing, even if these men of learning at the time and prejudice disagreed on the degrees and particulars of that racism. One of those particulars that Lovecraft, a deeply racist and xenophobic man even by the standards of his day, was a little school of thought called phrenology, and it's what we're going to dive into today. One of its founding thinkers wrote in his seminal text, quote, "I take it for granted that every kind of knowledge is useful," end quote. But it just ain't the case, even given the proviso that you're certain you possess real knowledge. I prefer a more modern author. A man must know how to look before he can hope to see. So let's talk a little bit about what people thought a brain was, how it worked long ago, what phrenology was, it is. And it's both comical and tragic episodes, death and resurgence up to this very goddamn day. Oh, and there's lots and lots of racism. Franz Joseph Gall was an Austrian doctor. He was born in 1758. Not all of his research and work was equally useless. He helped advance some techniques in dissection, made advances in the discipline of anatomy. And it turns out he was onto something, not exactly correct, in his general idea that different areas of the human brain do handle different human functions and cognitive abilities. But what he's most famous for is his development of organology, not a real discipline. This is the seed from which the poison tree that is phrenology sprung. So he basically assigned 27 different functions to 27 different layers of the cerebral cortex. That's the outer layer of neural tissue in a mammal's brain, basically, that he thought correlated with observable reality. We're not even to the super racist stuff yet, but here I must pause and note that these 27 different functions are really absolute folly when you look at them. Memory for people, memory for words, and memory for facts are all functions separately localized. Pride gets its own category. Religious sentiment gets its own category. Poetic talent, firmness of purpose, both make appearances. Metaphysical gibberish, if you ask me, having nothing to do with science or medicine, and almost all of it with no source but Gall's own head. Now, misguided as all of this was, it was a decent try, I guess, a theory that should have received earnest scientific consideration and inquiry, and then have been wholly dismissed as an inadequate framework of understanding the human mind at best. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in most scientific circles, with later phrenologists differing on the number and location of different traits, scientists like Jean-Pierre Florenz demonstrating fairly convincingly and repeatedly with experiments on the brains of pigeons that these supposed organs were imaginary, and any number of cases having to be explained away that just didn't comport with this universal framework Gall came up with, even if you jiggered it just so. So anyway, next part. As the cerebral cortex develops and grows, so the idea in phrenology goes anyway. This is all wrong. The cerebral cortex will fill out the cranial cavity, and by studying the dimensions and features of the cranium, the skull, basically, you could discern a person's cognitive abilities, their personality, their traits, habits. Now, in addition to straight-up skull measurements, phrenologists would famously feel for bumps, little features, divots on the skull of a person, in order to feel what regions of the person's brain were over or underdeveloped. This is what told them what they'll be good at and what they won't. Even things like how honest or loyal they'll tend to be, whether they'll tend towards bravery or cowardice, on and on. And if this sounds kind of like astrology or palm reading, but for the more sophisticated marks, it really should. Simple, empirical, elegant, and wrong. And like real money-charging fortune tellers and astrologers in our day, the secret is in reading things backwards. Here's a perfect example in Belgian professor and phrenologist Paul Boutz reading a bust of Julius Caesar. Quote, "Let's first take a look at Caesar's forehead. Is he a practical or a theoretical mind? Oh no, Caesar is certainly not a philosopher. However, his front is of a perfect architecture. Extreme width, nice height, even at the sizes, extremely well-developed base, even covers the eyes. This comes together with a very strong development of individuality. Very strong perceptions, practical orientations, taking into account every element. The front is slightly sloping. The lower part of it is more developed than the upper part, thus realist objective type. The causality, too, is rather negative. Very strong development of constructiveness, 4, which is reflected in Caesar's battle prowess, the Seas of Lycia, the bridge over the Rhine. The blind stone head, which fixes the strong psyche of this personality in masculine traits, overwhelms the observer with a mighty sentiment of beauty. The remarkable architecture of the skull, still enhanced by the strict facial expression, gives a strong impression. An ugly face for whom is guided by subjective impressions, a beautiful head, however, because of the tacit eloquence of this skull. It is very rare, in fact, on either living or dead persons to encounter someone where all psychological faculties were so sensibly balanced. giving as a result such a well-developed personality with such a penetrating intelligence, coupled with a fierce energy and destructiveness. 3. At the same time, however, we find a gross deficiency of moral faculties, negative conscientiousness. 5. So that this man was capable to sacrifice a whole world to the pride of his patrician class. Summarizing, a man perfectly built to win and obtain victory on earth. The benevolence 6 is rather neutral, the veneration 7, however, is depressed, and the godless creature, as which Caesar is known by history. The back of the head is slightly convex, 8. This man was thus able to give a certain affection. Facing his soldiers, he gave in fact signs of affection which made him very popular, even if his practical mind had an influence on this. The amativeness, 9, is clearly positive. The skull is much more developed at the ears than above them. Cautiousness, 10, is negative. The destructiveness, 3, being very wide, this gives brutal vindictiveness and fearlessness. The negative conscientiousness, 5, will make him act as an impostor. Added to the negative veneration, 7, and spirituality, all moral values will be trodden. End quote. By the way, 2 notes. That was not originally written in English, so sorry if the translation's a little clunky. And 2, each of those numbers is the number of a trait according to Professor Bout's particular brand of phrenology. Anyway, you'll learn far more about what Paul Boutz and perhaps men like him at the time generally thought of Julius Caesar than about any of the practical applications of phrenology from that preceding excerpt, because of course phrenology has no practical applications. By the way, Paul lived, worked, and taught in the 20th century, not the 18th or 19th. You might hear or read here and there that phrenology will fall out of fashion more or less completely by the 1850s, but that's really not true. If it's true at all, maybe only in Great Britain. Nevertheless, Gall's lectures at the time, in the early 1800s, were quite popular in the upper echelons of respectable elements of Vienna, where he lived. That was then part of the empire, under the control of the Habsburgs. In addition to his more scientifically conscientious opponents, who really did not take very long to pop up in significant numbers, he also found enemies among the Catholic Church in the emperor's court. Denounced as materialist and fatalist, this phrenology that left no room for free will or the soul began to generate attention from unsympathetic eyes. Things came to a head by December 1801, when Gall received a personal letter from the Emperor Francis II, who, as a matter of course, would let important reports on all manner of pressing state concerns go totally unread, let alone generate his written response. This letter from him to Gall read, in part, quote, "This doctrine concerning the head, which is talked about with much enthusiasm, will perhaps cause a few to lose their heads, and it also leads to materialism," end quote. 2 weeks after that, agents of the Austrian government straight up came to his house and told him to shut the fuck up and stop lecturing. So Gall left Vienna toward Europe to popular acclaim, if not warm scholarly reception. In Berlin, Germany was then not a united country, he lectured before the royal family there, where 2 medals were minted in his honor. He hit up Denmark, Holland, Switzerland, and finally France. Then, under the Emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, he originally only planned to stick around about a year, but he was no friend to this emperor either. Now, he lived well and prospered without a doubt, but the scientific establishment of France and the nation's Academy of Sciences objected to his theory from the very start, and it appears, at least according to some scholars reading the primary material, that his movement was never a massively popular idea among either a bunch of scientists or just a bunch of people in France. As a result, the history of phrenology in France has been mostly covered by historians of medicine, rather than social historians. Even if phrenology wasn't extraordinarily popular in France and was never accepted as a legitimate discipline of science to study, by the 1830s there would be at least 5 phrenology courses available for the taking in Paris. There were at least 3 in other departments throughout France, and societies of phrenology existed in Paris, of course, but also Lyon, Metz, Toulon, and other larger cities. But speaking of social history, before we follow phrenology from the warm embrace of Parisian salons, we need to stop and talk a little bit about racism. Now, I've talked a little bit about how on an individual level, Phrenology was used to incorrectly classify people's personalities, aptitudes, abilities, and tendencies based on the bumps in their skull. But it took basically no time at all for these spurious individual assessments to become wholly racialized and generalized. In particular, physiognomy of all different stripes. This is the art, such as it is, of judging a person's character from their facial features. This was all the rage in the first half of the 19th century. In fact, almost all phrenologists would quickly come to value physiognomy as much as phrenology, and the practice of using both these frameworks together to make judgments and assessments of individual human beings became far less important than their use as justifications for colonialism, class hierarchy, and scientific racism. By the way, for the following, I have substituted more neutral terms here for any old-timey ethnic slurs. So Gall spoke in Paris of how the Kalmuk peoples, a subgroup of steppe peoples of Mongolian descent, were predisposed to theft and duplicity, that the peoples of the Caribbean islands were cruel, superstitious, and stupid based on their skull shape. Now, some African peoples might improve with European education and guidance, but the Khoikhoi peoples of Africa, a traditionally nomadic and pastoral group from the southwest of the continent, were derided as hopelessly stupid, mere intermediaries between ape and man. The Maori people lacked the brain organs necessary to produce poetry. On and on. As for the class differences, supposedly empirical and obvious differences were pointed out between the average favored Frenchman, your lawyers, merchants, doctors, and the like, and the rachitic and deformed worker of our cities. Rachitic means weak, decrepit, or just inflicted with rickets. Now, for the burgeoning middle classes of the industrializing world, phrenology became a way to safely justify their new position in the hierarchy, above the proles, but below the ruling classes. And it became popular as a program for self-improvement and reform to some degree, where no scary class struggle was involved. In fact, for some workers, phrenology became attractive as a framework for education and enlightenment. Presumably, those workers would then go on to either advance their position or maybe topple the whole system over. Now, of course, professional phrenologists themselves could never agree on where precisely racial demarcations lie, biologically speaking. This is a problem that vexes scientific racists to this day, actually. And they could also never agree on the precise ranking of those races based upon abilities, but all agree that white Europeans were the most gifted and advanced, naturally. Now, in the first place, these dynamics both really take off in a more widespread way. It's not in France, but in Great Britain. Because it turns out that Johann Gasper Spurzheim, once Gall's personal anatomist and assistant, had some scores to settle over some posts. So, phrenology was getting more popular now with some sectors of the educated. Doctors, certainly, at a time when medicine was far less scientific than it is now. But also liberal reform types, lawyers, merchants, pharmacists, and some of the ruling classes who read and supported them. But scholarly opinions were incredibly divided over phrenology, with philosophers, scientists, other doctors, and religious figures all objecting to it on various grounds, usually related to the areas of the human mind and existence they thought they knew best. One pretty well circulated article from the 1815 Edinburgh Review read in part, quote, "How many disciples Dr. Spurzheim may have already collected from this class in England by his English book or his lectures in the metropolis, we do not feel very anxious to inquire, because we are quite certain we should find that they are more than 10 times the number he has seduced from the same proportion of persons in any other nation in Europe. Great Britain is a field for quacks to fatten in. They flock to it from all quarters of the world, and England is the sweetest corner of the pasture." End quote. Because, of course, Spurzheim had come, preaching his own refined phrenology. He would actually eventually finish his solo definitive work on the subject in 1825, Phrenology, or the doctrine of the mind and of the relations between its manifestations and the body. He's actually the real guy who popularized the term phrenology, by the way, a term Gall himself never liked or used. And though the Edinburgh Review had very publicly crapped all over Spurzheim by name, kind of ended up backfiring in a certain sense, at least temporarily, because it gave phrenology national exposure and made Spurzheim stride forth to publicly answer the author of the review, a man named John Gordon. In a series of lectures and dissections, he won many converts to his side, Spurzheim that is, and though John Gordon attended 2 of these dissections and made a number of challenges to Spurzheim on the finer points of anatomy, it appears that the technical nature of these objections was lost on most observers. They would continue to argue with each other in print, and others would argue with him too, but I really want to emphasize that sound challenges to the pseudoscience of phrenology were made as soon as phrenology itself was a thing. Challenges that phrenologists themselves never effectively answered. And yet, phrenology boomed big for a time. And at first, themes seemed pretty good for Spurzheim and his disciples. Phrenology was assisted by its lack of rigor in some ways, because it could mean something different to you depending on who you were. The greatest English phrenologist was not a doctor or a scientist, by the way, but a lawyer and the son of a brewer, George Combe. Of the membership of the dozens of phrenological societies that would pop up over the next 15 years in Great Britain, they tended to be made up of lawyers, merchants, manufacturers, social reformers. In the Edinburgh Society, the first and longest lasting, less than 20% were physicians, in fact. But this didn't stop Queen Victoria herself from calling for phrenology readings for her children. And according to book sales and commentary at the time, it was a far more influential and controversial school of thought than Darwin's theory of natural selection and On the Origin of Species, published 1859. Most evangelicals and conservative religious types were too busy protesting the naturalistic determinist phrenologists. By the way, as an aside, Darwin himself didn't really buy phrenology, writing in his diary with what seems a bit of an eye roll, quote, "If the phrenologists are to be trusted, I was well fitted in one respect to be a clergyman. A few years ago, the secretaries of a German psychological society asked me earnestly by letter for a photograph of myself, and sometimes afterwards I received the proceedings of one of the meetings in which it seemed that the shape of my head had been the subject of a public discussion, and one of the speakers declared that I had the bump of reverence developed enough for 10 priests." End quote. However, what little trappings of science the discipline of phrenology had slipped away steadily. In addition to being a popular contributor to scientific racism and scientific sexism, and a method of naturalistic self-improvement, phrenology also became an incredibly popular scam. Street vendors offering on-the-fly phrenology readings proliferated, and it's really this kind of phrenology that most significantly takes off in the hyper-capitalist United States a little bit later. Now, Spurzheim himself would die on a lecture tour in the States in 1832, kind of a blessing and a curse for phrenology. A blessing in that his death quickly made him a martyr. Phrenologists already well accustomed to playing martyrs and comparing themselves to the likes of Galileo for their science. And the outpouring of public attention and sympathy for Spurzheim did much to boost phrenology in the United States particularly. On the flip side, Spurzheim had at least eventually received a medical degree, and was one of phrenology's more effective advocates who at least spoke in the language of science. People were beginning to cotton to the scan over time. At its base, phrenology was about telling someone a compelling story about themselves. But it is less that phrenology disappeared in the face of academic skepticism among a population that just got smarter over time, and more that it became diffused into other practices and schools of thought, with its purists becoming increasingly fanatical about their persecution and practical about their business models. In particular, early anthropological and psychological societies in the coming generations would be founded by phrenologists, ex-phrenologists, or students and colleagues who attended a lot of phrenology lectures in the 20s and 30s. Phrenology was also really big among prison reformers and criminologists, too. Phrenology took on some adaptable characteristics where two men not of science but of God, originally trained for the ministry, that is, took up its flame. Oscar Squire Fowler and Lorenzo Niles Fowler would do more than any other two American men to inspire traveling phrenology lecturers and publications for decades, both before and after the United States Civil War. You see, Dr. Gall had a dark view of humanity in the end. He even labeled one of his sections of the brain murder. And he lamented that the vast majority of people on this earth would never find it within themselves to overcome their natural deficiencies. Dr. Spurzheim, on the other hand, in his spin-off George Combe, took another tack. Their program, however goofy their pseudoscience, was also about self-improvement, education, even if it became far more useful and popular as a justification for racism, sexism, or just scamming someone. But in these two Fowler brothers, phrenology will effectively showcase both sides of this coin and basically dump any attempt to advance its school of thought upon scientific lines. And they were phenomenally popular, not just with the yokels either. James Garfield, who would become President of the United States, had at least 2 and probably 3 phrenology readings in 1854 and in 1857, and probably again in 1864. The 1857 reading read, according to Garfield in part, quote, "Brain very large, too large. Great amount of vitality. You cannot wear out if you have any regard to physical law. You will not reach your meridian in life and strength until you are 45 years old. Your strength lies in your general power. The whole of your machinery comes to the help of any one part, thus giving great force. When your intellect is engaged, your feelings are too. And when your feelings are engaged, so is your intellect. Remarkable power of accumulating knowledge, bent of mind for science, but is getting more and more for literature. In faith, you are autonomous, dynamis, wonderful memory, ear for music good, talent for it ordinary. Enjoy fun, and make it. Your fun is the offspring of wit and fancy. Have high ideas of worth and character, a disposition to do good. You have a great deal of poetic talent. You have a good degree of self-esteem, are very warm-hearted. Always had to love something. Should have a wife to keep you in the right place. You have the powers and qualities to be a good general. Your mental grasp, equal to any task, can accomplish whatever you undertake and determine to do. Set your mark as high as it can be placed, and then work up to it. You want a wife, refined, genteel, graceful, of a philosophic mind, sharp, lively, sprightly, forehead high and broad." End quote. Phrenology in America was also phenomenally popular with racists, slavers, those who really valued white supremacy too. And this fear, in fact, I'd say it has yet to completely wash away. But in any case, far into the beginning of the 20th century, books were being published with titles like Heads, Faces, Types, Races, 1910, or Phrenology, How to Tell Your Own and Your Friend's Character from the Shape of the Head, also 1910, and Character Analysis, Subman or Superman, 1924. Now, the Fowler brothers themselves were so phenomenally popular that the phrenological movement in Great Britain, which was basically in the middle of dying, was actually revived temporarily. When Lorenzo Fowler and his wife relocated to England, truly the fattest corner of the pasture indeed. The British Phrenological Society, founded in 1886, not by Spurzheim, not by Combe or any of their direct disciples, but Lorenzo Fowler, didn't close up shop officially until 1967. Typically accepted as the last scientific phrenology society. But by now we're on our 4th country, and phrenology's manifestations and the motivations behind it were becoming ever more crass and naked. So on the one hand, you got the books, the pamphlets, the charts, and most famously, the models of the human head with all the little brain organs mapped out. If you happen across a phrenology model with all the sectors of the skull mapped out in ink, chances are it's one of those Fowler heads. So there's big money for true believers. People have chosen to believe in order to simplify a complicated and scary world, and disingenuous hucksters all you are welcome in the Church of Phrenology. And on the other side, you got phrenology that's hugely important for the South's slaveholding class, as an additional scientific justification for why slavery was good for the slave, while also being embraced by some abolitionists who viewed it as a framework for the uplifting of African Americans. By the way, I hasten to add that scholarship among those African American people epically destroyed phrenology more than once, and were thus far ahead of their counterparts in the white community on this issue. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois challenged phrenology and other schools of scientific racism with detailed charts, evidence, and, well, basically just logic and reason, many times over his career, notably at the 1900 Paris World Exposition. Frederick Douglass grappled with phrenology and race science throughout his entire life as a free man, doing his best to fight science with more science, working to spread liberation through knowledge, and challenging scientific racism's pretensions of objectivity. There is much more to explore on the topic of phrenology that I've decided to leave aside. It was actually really important in reinforcing traditional gender roles with the language of science, too. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass came printed with the author's very own phrenological chart, which he was quite proud of. Ishmael of Herman Melville's Moby Dick is a very learned phrenologist. This is often used as a source of humor in that text. Mark Twain went the practical route, of course. Just had his head read more than once by the same person, once without identifying who he was, and once while doing so. His readings were totally different, because of course they were. He never bought into phrenology. Phrenology was so much to so many over time. A stab at a theory of the brain, a woefully misguided pseudoscience, a vehicle for hucksterism to varying degrees, and an important part of the puzzle, and the efforts of some to empirically justify the unjustifiable, a society based on white supremacy as a fundamental value. I've mentioned before on the show that I'm not really much of a philosopher of any kind, except perhaps of the amateur political variety. That is still true. But one of those philosophical types, a man named Karl Popper, once said something like, "A theory that explains everything explains nothing." In other words, I think, a system of thought that explains away any apparent contradiction or hard case is a poor one. Such theories can't predict what will happen, but only ever appear to be valid in retrospect. And science in the early 19th century, young as it was, cottoned onto this in regards to Dr. Gall's theories immediately. On empirical, logical, methodological, metaphysical, and later sociological grounds, phrenology would be absolutely proven to be, at best, accidentally correct about a few things, and wrong about everything else, which is even less useful than it sounds. Because how would anyone understand why phrenology was correct about the things it was accidentally correct about? That previous sentence goes out to all the to-be sures I had to read for this episode about how some of phrenology's founding principles happened to be correct. And these scientific challenges did not take decades of advancements in technology. They appeared incredibly quickly and immediately, and among the vast majority of the developing scientific communities throughout the world. Phrenology, as a scientific discipline for advancing knowledge, basically stopped around 100 years before the last Phrenological Society disbanded. In this sense, facts and reason definitively won the day. But it wasn't enough, was it? Phrenology spread nonetheless because there was a buck to make off of it, telling people what they wanted to hear, and because it reinforced colonialism, racism, and white supremacy effectively. It still lurks here and there in our world. It may even be growing among its enthusiasts, The incel community has a fair number of members convinced that their skull shape is keeping them from having sex. And there's a few small old websites and subforums out there still standing for phrenology unapologetically. If the truth were enough to vanquish useful and profitable lies, lies that explain everything, then phrenology would have died before humans invented the automobile. It makes me think a fair amount about spurious evolutionary psychologists, or those who deny anthropomorphic climate change. All of them have arguments, and all of those arguments, as near as I could tell, have been answered or dismantled in multiple ways by multiple people from multiple disciplines of human learning. Yet they persist, not because the truth is not known, but because accepting truth comes with conditions attached. I kind of wish I had a more elegant conclusion, a better lesson. It's somewhat grim to realize that ignorance and truth aren't, in the end, as matched in power as we might wish. Which is not to say that I'm not a fan of truth, just to say that what this is really about is power. The power that comes with an intellectual framework, propagated and justified by the powerful, that seeks to justify society based upon the fundamental truth that all men are not created equal, but that the white ones are just better, period. Or the power that comes with an intellectual framework that justifies capital's extraction of ever more oil and gas from the planet's crust to be burned for fuel. Phrenology was basically only ever popular with white people for a very good reason. And it's not because the other races are actually just way smarter and more skeptical than white people are, although, hey, maybe that is true. No, it was because it offered a useful avenue for those white people, a sophisticated way for them to justify a so-called natural racial hierarchy in distinct ways from the feudalism that came before it. The argument's dressed now not in the language of God, but in the language of science. It helped them justify and maintain their power. And there's always money in defending the rich and powerful in new and creative ways. Also, I don't know why I just thought of this, but congratulations to Dave Rubin of the Rubin Report on his new partnership with Blaze TV. I assume both parties are excited about the potential marketing and revenue sharing opportunities and defending the rich and powerful in new and creative ways. Thank you for listening. The fact that I have an audience at all is the most amazing thing about this show. Patreon.com/DistantPeasant. PayPal.me/DistantPeasant. There is a website. It is headquarters, distantpeasant.com. I will see you next time.